Killer. The Return of Jeffrey Woods. Written and narrated by Steve Gray. This is a direct follow-up to the K. Banning Kellum story, Jeff the Killer. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow die not, poor death, nor canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soon our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy and charms can make us sleep well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. John Donne, The Holy Sonnets. Prologue. For some, the breaking of the dawn comes too soon at times. Of course, for others, it doesn't come soon enough. For one daybreak in particular, the rising sun would find itself to be the host of loathing. It would cast its waking glance over the horizon, and its radiance would be met with utter despair. It would see that while it had been sleeping, evil would have taken the artist's brush, and with its shriveled hand, painted the landscape in lakes of blood. It would weep, because his day had once again arrived. His coming was as senseless as the coming of the diseases of the world, and as purposeful as the plagues. Or maybe it tended to lean toward more superlative reasoning. Perhaps it was vindication for pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, sloth, and every filthy transgression people are capable of, or capital vice which holds them in its grip. Or it's as simple as he was an anomaly, a deviation or departure from the normal or common order, form, or rule of things. It didn't matter. The point is, he had come back. Jeffrey Woods, the Killer. Part 1. Monica. It was 6 p.m., and the treetops were basking in the final rays of diminishing sunlight. The shades were drawn, cigarette smoke pervaded the room, and a bottle of Alba Scotch whiskey, nearly empty, sat upon the coffee table. It was looking as though rain was approaching. Monica Davenport sat in her recliner, listening to the tape over and over, a routine that she has perpetuated every night for several years. It had driven her to the edge of sanity, the tragedy of it all, the loss of her friend and editor, Rosenberg, her mentor. The tape was nearly destroyed. Every time she played it, its degeneration worsened. She knew that she would eventually have to transfer the contents of the tape to digital form, but she hesitated. In some twisted way, she thought that maybe with the final deterioration of the gamma ferric oxide, maybe the memories and thoughts would die. Oh, and the dreams. Maybe they would die too. Just maybe. On the night of the murder, Jeff Woods was gone when the police arrived. At the tent where he had been giving Rosenberg his account of everything, his long drawn-out explanation of how things came to be in his life, and finally realizing his addiction to what he referred to as the syrup, or the ichor. He had slipped through the exit slit of the tent and into the wooded area at the rear shortly before the cops arrived. The evening progressed, and Monica stayed in deep thought. The vision of Rosenberg's badly slashed body was never more than an arm's reach from Monica's memory. She figured it would never be further from that, at least until the day she died. She was recalling remembering that night when she had arrived at the tent. It was already heavily bustling with activity from the local police and homicide detectives. They were going in and coming out of the tent as she frantically ran toward it. A visceral light show was being created by the flashing lights of the surrounding police cruisers, as well as intermittent popping flashes of a camera coming from inside. She was hysterically screaming as she ran toward the entrance of the tent. "Chief!" she cried. A few officers rushed to restrain her. "Ma'am, you can't go in there," one of the officers shouted as he grabbed her arm. "Let go of me!" she shrieked as she jerked her arm away from his grip. One officer who had been unrolling crime scene tape dropped the roll and ran to assist in restraining her. They struggled to keep her from going inside, but despite their efforts, she broke free and immediately snapped back the entrance flap and ran inside the tent. She froze, and so did time. She heard nothing but silence and the racing pulse in her ears. The interior of the fireworks tent was only dimly lit by the strobing red and blue police cruiser lights outside. They were illuminating the canvas walls of the tent. Just enough light to see what was before her. Too much. Chief Editor Rosenberg's mutilated corpse lay in front of her. The wooden folding chair that he had been sitting in lay scattered in pieces surrounding him. As she gazed in horror at his body, she remained frozen, just as her face was frozen in a silent scream. She had wished that the officers would have worked harder to keep her out. But now they were all standing behind and beside her. A few had deadpan stares fixed on the ground at their own feet. The man who had been snapping the crime scene photos a minute prior lowered his camera and with a mournful face looked at Monica and stepped toward the exit of the tent. In a few seconds, she could barely notice hands gripping her arms and wrists, leading her outward, as she stared at Rosenberg's gore-ridden body as it lied defeated upon the blood-moistened straw flooring. What she saw in the final few seconds of being in the tent would stay indelibly stamped on her mind from then on. Rosenberg's body lay in a disgusting heap. Monica's tears flowed profusely, and they shined gloss-like in the softly glowing tent. She observed his morbidly obese body laying in what looked to be the throes of a temper tantrum. His upper torso lay flat on its back, while his lower body lay sideways, left leg draped over the other. His hands were locked and hooked into claw-like poses reaching skyward. She cried. She observed the pain in his facial expression. His head was thrown back in an eternal scream of terror. Eyes looking upward, glossy, like dusty marbles. The gashes in his body made her think of some nature documentary she'd seen years ago, where whalers in New Bedford had their gigantic catches in line on massive docks. The deep slits in their hulking bodies exposed pinkish, bloody blubber. This, what she was seeing now, was obscenely similar to that. The police led her out of the tent, and she went, watching Rosenberg's twisted, slashed body fade out of sight as she exited. What happened after that she could only remember in scattered memory fragments. And even now, she's not very clear on the direct series of events that occurred afterwards. Crack! She jumped, and her eyes instantly widened. The thunder outside as the rain began jolted her back to the present. She sat for a second, and then leaned forward in her recliner and reached for the bottle of scotch. She poured a stiff knock. Then she sat the bottle back down, next to the freshly polished barrel of the Nighthawk North Sky Hawk revolver. She had been staring at it the entire time she was strolling down her morbid memory lane. She'd bought this pistol a few years back. What her intentions were at the time of purchase were unclear and malformed, almost innocuous. After what had happened to Rosenberg, and how close-knit she was to the case, she just knew that she had better get it. A former boyfriend, who was a gun freak of sorts, had turned her onto this particular one. The rain was now coming down heavily, and the thunder strikes were regular. She was now pushed over the edge of having a plain buzz to being full drunk. She was going to have to go to sleep. She had considered her torment enough for the evening. Another evening listening to that diabolical voice on the tape, staring down at that pistol again, having a deep-rooted knowledge that she was going to use it someday. It was an ambiguous idea, though. Who was going to catch the bullet? She was always possessed by the notion that she would hunt down Jeffrey Woods to exact vengeance for Rosenberg, much the obsession, just as Ahab had the obsession for his white whale. She would punch his ticket. Of course, there was also the alternative, that just one day the guilt and the torment would be just about too much to take. The need to erase the constant racing thoughts and dreams would possibly cause her to make the decision to pick up the pistol, and with tears streaming down her blank face, place the business end in her mouth, and suddenly her thoughts would be replaced by scenes of open fields and colorful flowers, gentle breezes, and cerulean blue. The rain continued outside. She leaned back in her recliner and eventually slipped into a fitful sleep. The thunder clapped regularly. About 7 miles away from Monica's house, the rain had not yet reached. Oh, there were claps of thunder in the distance, and there were hints of its approach, but it hadn't yet to reach this place. The edge of a tree line, a dark figure stood amidst the trees, dried maple leaves blowing across its feet. It stared. It was staring at the amber glow coming from a window of a house. Part 2. Randy. Randy was dreaming. Nothing in particular, just the sporadic scenes of an exhausted mind. It had been a long day, and he'd worked his ass off. As a tire technician at the Wheels Depot on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain, he'd seen his fair share of busy days, that's assured, but for some reason, today, the ass-bustometer had hit full tilt. When he had finally arrived home that night, at 9:30, he'd only had the desire to peel a few slices of cooked ham off the lunch meat stack and crack the tab of an ice-cold brew. He had been whipped, and it wasn't going to be long for him to zonk out. Eventually, when he finally sank into deep sleep, his dreams were of his mother tapping 16-penny nails into the wall of his childhood home. She was hanging art prints that she had bought at the flea market. Pointless dreams, familiar scenes. And the night went along with quiet fluidity. The peepers and crickets outside sounded off a mellow concerto as the air grew cooler. The quiet, the peace, the night's lucidity. Tapping. Tapping. His room was dead quiet. Randy brushed the back of his hand across his nose. Tapping. Randy shifted. Tapping. He farted. More tapping, and the sound was subtly combining with his dreams. Tapping. His mother's widow's hammer tapping nails into the wall with metronome-like regularity. Tapping, only more impatiently now. Randy was beginning to swim up toward consciousness, and the tapping persisted. It was coming from the front door. Tap. 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 Randy looked at his clock. 11:20 p.m. Who the fuck is that? He murmured to himself. He was not one who was accustomed to company, let alone company that would come calling at this time of night. Tap. 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 Slower cadence now. Hold on, shit! He had a hard-on. He lazily grabbed the dirty uniform pants that laid in a dead heap next to his bed. He put them on over his legs, and as he pulled them up, he shifted his penis to one side to finish the job. Now there was silence. Still, Randy reached over the bed and grabbed the Louisville Slugger he had laying on the floor. He slowly made his way down the hallway, occasionally bracing himself against the wall. He was lightheaded both from sleep and the beers he had drank earlier. Finally, he stood in front of the door where the tapping had been. Silence. He did actually hear some shuffling right outside. "Okay, pricks, here I come," He jerked the door open and was met with the cool night breeze and the occasional reluctant chirping of peepers and crickets, but nothing more. After a minute, he rubbed his face and shook his head. He took a step outside. Standing on the top step, he surveyed the area. His head was spinning, and he felt a slight lurch in his stomach. He knew that he had heard tapping. "I'm going to check out and just make sure." He took a few steps down the stairs, holding onto the stair railing for balance. He looked around and saw nothing. He took a few steps further down the sidewalk, toward the front of the house. Still nothing. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, a tall, dark shape was standing right in front of him. He felt two strong hands grab him by the biceps and nearly lift him off the ground. He was being attacked. This dark shape threw Randy against the stair railing of the doorsteps. With a gasp of pain and disbelief, Randy fell to the ground as his legs refused to support him. Grunting and reaching for his back, he looked up at the shape who was coming toward him. He desperately tried to crawl away, but the agony of where his back had struck the stair railing slowed him up. This dark shape stopped and, with head cocked, looked down at Randy. Randy looked up at him and saw his silhouette against the streetlight. His breaths were visible. They were deep and steady, and they floated away as wisps against the night air. Randy tasted something strange in the back of his throat and got scared. It was a salty, coppery taste. It was blood. As he continued to watch this grunting shadow, he coughed and wiped his mouth. He looked down at his hand and saw. It was blood. He was bleeding internally. Suddenly his pain grew. He looked up once again at this crazed person who had just rifled him into a wrought iron stair railing, who was now glaring a cocked-headed stare at him. Randy was terrified but knew he had better make an attempt to get away and get help. So he tried. As he began to crawl away, it was nearly impossible. The pain was immeasurable. Despite that, he tried. The shadowy being continued to stand in one spot staring down at Randy's futile attempts to get away. Heavy breaths were still visible against the light of the street lamp. Randy gasped and fought through the constant searing pain that was shooting through his back. Blood was clogging his nasal passage, causing him to sneeze, which made the pain worse. Strangely, he began to reflect. He began to think about being back in bed. 20 minutes earlier, he thought of how he would have done this whole thing over differently, about how he would have reached for the phone to call the police the very second he thought something was foul. He thought that going back 20 minutes would be the same as finding a wad of cash. He suddenly heard clumsy, shuffling steps. The shadow shambled after him. He did not look back. It grunted and giggled as it moved slowly toward him. Randy heard something familiar in that giggle, but he couldn't scream. The pain was too intense. His movements were becoming more lethargic, and the crimson fluid that was coming out of his mouth was getting thicker. Suddenly, breath was forced out of his lungs with a crushing jolt. It felt as though he had fallen from a respectable height and landed on his back. Even more searing pain shot through him, only this time it came from between his shoulder blades. His mouth was agape and his eyes widened in a visual scream of horror. He had been attempting to crawl away on his stomach, but now had rolled over onto his backside again. He looked up to see this shape standing over him, and he understood. It was Jeff. Holy shit, it was Jeff! And he saw the reason why he had felt this sudden shock of pain. Jeff had picked up a concrete garden gnome and had struck him between the shoulder blades. Randy's breaths were short and were nothing more than gasps for air. Furious pain racked through his body as Jeff brought the heavy garden gnome down with sickening blow after blow. His grunts and crazed giggles accentuated the nauseating scene. Randy's fragmented shrieks and bloody gasps for air became one. His fingers froze in a kind of arthritic-looking seizure. It appeared like he were desperately gripping air. A pool of dark scarlet blood was gathering on the ground at his mid-back. It seeped into the sandy grass where he lay half on and half off the walkway. Jeff bathed himself in now arterial spray as the brutality continued. The grin on the concrete garden gnome's face was steady as it plunged time after time into Randy's opened chest cavity. The paint on the gnome's happy grin, which was decidedly faded from years of being kissed by the morning sun, was now even duller in comparison to the visceral stripes of Randy's blood, which had draped across its cherry cheeks. Randy wasn't shrieking anymore. He wasn't gasping for air anymore. His gaze was now facing skyward, and his eyes were slowly moving in opposite directions from each other as the ocular muscles retired. He felt the rivers of his own blood streaming from his shattered body and out of his opened mouth. The final moments of consciousness found him not noticing his blood, or the terrible beating by the concrete garden gnome, or the hideous mockery of Jeff, who had been crushing him. But instead, his quickly fading view was of watching his mother tapping 16-penny nails into the wall with a widow's hammer.